Alarms tore through the command deck of my flagship, and I gripped the edge of my console as another wave of Zharn fighters broke through our outer shield. My name is Aelthara Voskai, heir to the Kathrani Dominion, and on that night, I watched 3 of my remaining warships die in the space of 40 seconds. Princess, the Eastern Fleet is gone, my tactical officer, Doran, shouted over the noise. His voice cracked, not from fear of dying, but from the weight of what dying meant. If the Eastern Fleet fell, the refugee stations behind it fell too. Thousands of children were sheltered there, sent away from the front lines, because their parents believed distance meant safety. Distance meant nothing anymore. I had inherited a war I did not start. My mother, the reigning monarch, lay in a medical stasis pod 3 systems away, wounded during the first Zharn strike 6 months earlier. Command had fallen to me, a woman who had spent most of her life studying diplomacy and trade law, not war. I was not built for this. But the Dominion needed someone standing at the front, and I refused to hide while our people burned. The Zharn Collective had once been a minor irritant, a scattered group of raiders operating on the edges of our territory. Then, without warning, they unified under a single command, acquired weapons technology that outclassed anything we possessed, and began a systematic conquest of every system bordering our space. Nobody understood how a loose group of raiders had transformed into a disciplined, overwhelming force in less than a year. Some whispered they had found an ancient cache of weapons. Others believed an outside power was arming them. I did not care about the reason. I only cared about survival. "Princess, incoming transmission from Station Halvan," Doran said, his hands moving fast across the console. "They're requesting immediate evacuation support. The station cannot hold." I closed my eyes for half a second, just long enough to steady myself. Station Halvan housed nearly 4,000 children, along with caretakers, teachers, and a skeleton crew of medical staff. It was supposed to be safe. Nothing was safe anymore. "Divert the reserve cruisers," I ordered, all of them. "Princess, if we divert the reserves, we lose our defensive line at the capital approach. Then we lose it," I said. "Do it now." Doran hesitated only a moment before executing the command. I understood the risk. I understood that stripping our defenses to save one station might open a path for the Zharn straight to our capital world. But I could not let those children die while I had ships capable of saving them. My mother had taught me that a leader who abandons the smallest and weakest of her people does not deserve to lead at all. The battle raged for 6 more hours. By the time the Zharn withdrew, likely to regroup rather than out of mercy, we had lost 11 ships and gained nothing except survival for 1 more day. I stood on the observation deck afterward, staring at the wreckage drifting silently in the void. Thousands of pieces of metal that had once been vessels crewed by people I knew by name. I returned to my private quarters that night and opened a communication channel that had not been used in decades. It connected, according to ancient Dominion records, to a species called humanity, residents of a planet called Earth. My advisors had scoffed when I first mentioned this option days earlier. "They are primitives," Counselor Mirith had said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Barely capable of interstellar travel, according to the old surveys. Sending a plea to them would be an embarrassment." "The old surveys are 80 years out of date," I had replied. "Every other option has failed. Every ally who owed us favors has abandoned us." "I will not let pride cost us the last of our people." Mirith had not argued further, though his expression made clear he considered the decision beneath the dignity of the Dominion. I did not care. Dignity would not save Station Halvan. Dignity would not save the 4,000 children hiding in its lower decks, listening to explosions through reinforced walls, wondering if the next one would be the last sound they ever heard. I recorded the distress message myself, refusing to delegate something so important to a junior officer reading from a script. I spoke plainly, without exaggeration, describing our losses, our dwindling resources, and the scale of the threat bearing down on us. I did not ask for pity. I asked for help. And I made clear, we understood, we had no right to expect it from strangers, separated from us by more distance than most of my people could comprehend. The message launched into the void, carried by a relay signal designed decades ago and never properly tested. I had no confidence it would even reach its destination, let alone receive a response. I expected silence. I prepared myself for silence, the way a soldier prepares for a wound she knows is coming. 3 days passed. The Jarn struck 2 more outposts during that time, both smaller than Halvin, both defended by aging patrol ships that stood little chance against modern Jarn technology. We evacuated what civilians we could, and lost the rest to either capture or worse. I stopped sleeping in anything more than short, broken stretches. Every hour felt like it might be the hour I received word that my mother's condition had worsened, or that the capital itself was under direct assault. On the 4th day, Doran burst into my private council chamber without the usual formalities, his face pale. "Princess, we have a response," he said, "from Earth." I stood so quickly my chair nearly toppled. "Play it." The transmission that followed was brief, spoken in a language our translation systems processed with only minor delay. A voice, calm and measured, identified itself as belonging to something called Earth Defense Coordination. The voice stated that a vessel had already been dispatched, that it would arrive within the time frame of what humans measured as days, not the months or years I had braced myself to wait. The voice offered no explanation for how they could respond so quickly across such distance, and it offered no demands, no conditions, nothing but a simple confirmation that help was coming. I did not know whether to feel relief or unease. A species we barely understood, one my own advisors dismissed as primitive, had somehow mobilized a response faster than any of our supposed allies within our own sector of space, faster than should have been possible, given what our old surveys claimed about their technology. "Counselor Myrith will want to know how they managed such a rapid deployment," Doran said carefully. "Counselor Myrith can ask them himself when they arrive," I said, though privately the same question gnawed at me. Our surveys were old, yes, but not so old that a species could leap from primitive travel to interstellar response times measured in days. Something about the transmission's confidence unsettled me more than the silence before it had. I spent the following 2 days preparing, though I hardly knew what preparation meant in this context. I ordered our diplomatic staff to review every scrap of information the Dominion archives held on humanity, which turned out to be embarrassingly little. A handful of first contact reports from decades ago, describing a species confined mostly to a single world, prone to internal conflict, technologically inferior in every measurable category. The reports painted a picture of a curiosity, not a rescuer. "There must be some mistake," Myrith said during one of our final briefings before the ship's expected arrival. "Perhaps they misunderstood the request. Perhaps they are sending a diplomatic envoy rather than any form of military support. We will find out soon enough," I said, though his words planted a small seed of doubt in me as well. What if humanity had misread our plea? What if they arrived with nothing more than well wishes and a promise to relay our situation to some larger governing body that would take months to respond? I forced the thought aside. Doubt would not help me lead. I needed to remain steady for the people watching me. On the 5th day, our long-range sensors detected an anomaly at the edge of our system, an object moving at a velocity our own instruments struggled to properly calculate. Doran called me to the bridge immediately. "Princess, we have a contact," he said. "Single vessel. It is not matching any known Jarn signature, and it is not matching anything in our own database either. Human? Unknown, but the timing suggests it must be. I ordered our remaining fleet to hold position and avoid any aggressive posturing. Whatever this vessel was, I did not want a misunderstanding to turn our one hope for aid into another enemy. I stood at the observation window, watching the growing dot on the display resolve slowly into a shape as it closed the distance faster than any ship I had ever witnessed. It was smaller than I expected. Compared to the sprawling, ornate warships of the Dominion, or even the jagged, aggressive silhouettes of Jarn dreadnoughts, this vessel appeared almost plain, functional, without a single decorative element. No banners, no elaborate hull markings, nothing that suggested pride or ceremony. Just clean lines and a quiet, confident presence that unsettled me more than any show of force could have. "Sensors are reading its hull composition now," Doran said, studying his readouts with a furrowed brow. "Princess, this material does not match anything in our database. And Princess, the ship's approach vector suggests deceleration profiles well beyond what our own engines are capable of producing." I said nothing, watching the vessel settle into a stable position relative to our flagship, close enough to communicate, far enough to avoid any appearance of aggression. It hung there in the black, silent, patient, waiting. "Open a channel," I said. The transmission crackled to life a moment later. The same calm voice from before, though this time coming directly from the ship rather than relayed across the void. "This is the Earth vessel Meridian Accord," the voice said. "We received your distress signal and responded as quickly as our capabilities allowed. We understand your situation is urgent. Please advise how we may assist." I stepped forward toward the primary communication console, aware that every officer on the bridge was watching me, waiting to see how their princess would address this strange new arrival. "This is Princess Aelthara Vossiskai of the Kethrani Dominion," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the questions racing through my mind. "We are grateful for your swift response. Our people are under sustained assault by a hostile force known as the Zharn Collective. We require military assistance, and we require it as soon as possible." There was a brief pause before the voice responded. "Understood, Princess. We have already dispatched additional support according to your stated needs. A representative will be transferring aboard your vessel shortly to coordinate directly." "Additional support," I repeated, glancing at Mirith, who stood rigid near the far wall, his expression unreadable. "How many ships does that represent?" "One representative," the voice replied. "We believe this will be sufficient." I felt my stomach tighten. One representative, not a fleet, not even a squadron. A single individual, sent to address a war that had already cost us dozens of ships and thousands of lives. I opened my mouth to protest, to demand they reconsider, to explain in painful detail exactly how outmatched we were. But before I could speak, Doran's console chimed with an incoming docking request. "Princess," he said quietly, "they're already requesting permission to dock." I stared at the small, unassuming vessel outside our window, feeling something between disbelief and anger rising in my chest. We had asked for a weapon capable of turning the tide of a war that threatened to erase my people from the stars, and Earth had sent us one person. I did not yet know that the man about to walk through my airlock would prove to be more dangerous than every warship in my fleet combined. But in that moment, standing on my bridge surrounded by officers who shared my disbelief, all I felt was the cold, sinking certainty that we had been abandoned by the one hope I had allowed myself to trust. "Grant docking permission," I said finally, my voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Let us see what Earth considers sufficient." The airlock cycled open 40 minutes later, and I walked toward the docking bay flanked by Doran and two members of my personal guard, bracing myself for whatever this so-called representative might be. I expected arrogance, perhaps, or a diplomat's practiced smile designed to soften an unwelcome message. I expected excuses. What I did not expect was the ordinary-looking man who stepped through the airlock carrying nothing more than a simple satchel. Dressed in clothing that bore no obvious rank or military insignia, his expression calm in a way that felt entirely out of place aboard a warship preparing for the next wave of an increasingly desperate conflict. He looked, for all purposes, like someone who had wandered into the wrong building.
"Princess Aelthara," he said, inclining his head slightly in greeting. "My name is Callum Whitfield. I understand you're dealing with quite a lot right now."
I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that additional forces waited just behind him, ready to follow through the airlock. None came. He stood alone, unarmed as far as I could tell, watching me with a patience that felt almost unnerving given the circumstances. "You are the support Earth sent," I said, not quite able to keep the disbelief from my voice. "I am," he said simply. I felt Mirith's earlier warnings echoing in my mind, and for the first time since sending that desperate transmission days ago, I wondered if reaching out to humanity had been a mistake after all. But something in the man's steady gaze, something quiet and unshaken beneath his unremarkable exterior, made me hesitate before dismissing him entirely. Whatever Callum Whitfield was, he did not carry himself like a man unprepared for what waited beyond that airlock, and despite every instinct telling me this could not possibly be enough, a small, stubborn part of me decided to wait and see. I led Callum Whitfield through the corridors of my flagship, aware of the stares from crew members who passed us, their eyes flicking between their princess and the strange, unremarkable human walking beside her. Word had already spread that Earth had sent a single representative rather than a fleet, and I could feel the weight of their disappointment pressing against me, even though none of them dared say a word aloud. "You'll have to forgive the staring," I said as we walked. Most of my crew have never seen a human before. Some of them expected something more imposing. "I get that a lot," Callum said, his tone light, almost amused. "I've learned not to take it personally." I studied him from the corner of my eye. He walked without hurry, without the tension I would have expected from someone stepping into the middle of an active war zone. His satchel hung from one shoulder, and aside from that single bag, he carried nothing. No weapon, no armor, no visible technology beyond a simple device strapped to his wrist that occasionally flickered with soft light. "Forgive my bluntness," I said, unable to hold back the question any longer, but I requested military assistance. I requested ships, weapons, soldiers capable of turning back an enemy that has already destroyed a significant portion of my fleet. Instead, Earth sent one man with a bag. "I do not understand how you are meant to help us." Callum did not seem offended by the question. If anything, his expression softened slightly, as though he had anticipated it long before stepping aboard my ship. "I understand the confusion, Princess. Truly, I do. But Earth Defense Coordination doesn't send people into situations like this without good reason. I promise you that." "Then explain the reason to me," I said, stopping in the corridor and turning to face him directly, "because from where I stand, my people are dying, and I have been given no evidence that you can stop that from continuing." He met my gaze without flinching, and for the first time since he had stepped off his ship, I saw something shift behind his calm exterior, something heavier, older, carrying weight I could not yet identify. "I've spent most of my adult life responding to situations other people considered impossible to fix," he said quietly. "Conflicts where children were caught in the middle, where the people supposedly in charge had already given up on finding a peaceful resolution. I don't carry a fleet with me, Princess, because in my experience, a fleet is rarely the thing that actually solves these situations." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that the Jarn Collective was not some localized conflict he could resolve through diplomacy or clever negotiation, but something in his tone stopped me. He spoke not like a man offering empty reassurance, but like someone stating a simple, well-established fact. We continued walking until we reached the command deck, where Mirith waited along with several senior officers, all of them regarding Callum, with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Mirith stepped forward first, his posture rigid with barely restrained anger. "This is the assistance Earth has sent us," he said, not bothering to disguise the contempt in his voice. "One man. While our people die by the thousands, Earth sends a single representative, as though this were a diplomatic courtesy call, rather than a war for our survival." "Counselor Mirith," I said sharply, though privately his frustration mirrored my own, "this is not the time." "With respect, Princess, I believe it is exactly the time," Mirith pressed on, turning his attention fully toward Callum. "Tell me, human, what precisely do you intend to do against an enemy fleet capable of overwhelming our best warships? Do you carry some hidden arsenal in that bag of yours? Some secret weapon your species has been withholding from the rest of the galaxy?" Callum regarded Mirith for a long moment before responding, his tone remaining calm despite the counselor's obvious hostility. "No hidden arsenal, counselor. Just experience with the kind of problem your people are facing." Mirith let out a short, humorless laugh. "Experience. Forgive me if that fails to reassure me, given the scale of what we face." I watched the exchange with growing unease, caught between my counselor's understandable frustration and something in Callum's steady demeanor that refused to be shaken by insults or doubt. I decided the only way forward was to gather actual information rather than continue exchanging accusations in front of the entire command deck. "Enough," I said, raising a hand to silence Mirith before he could continue. "Mr. Whitfield, I would like a full briefing on your capabilities, your intended approach, and any resources Earth has provided you with. If we are to trust you with the fate of my people, I require more than assurances." Callum nodded, apparently unbothered by the demand. "That's fair, Princess. I'll tell you everything I can." We retreated to a smaller conference room, away from the tension of the command deck, though Mirith insisted on joining us, despite my initial preference to speak with Callum alone. Doran accompanied us as well, along with two senior military advisors, all of them settling around the table with expressions that ranged from cautious curiosity to lingering distrust. Callum set his satchel on the table and withdrew a small, unassuming device that projected a soft display above its surface. Before I explain anything about the current situation, I think it might help if you understood a bit about who I am and what I actually do, he said. Earth doesn't typically send military forces to resolve conflicts like this one. What we send, when the situation calls for it, are specialists trained to address specific kinds of threats. And what specific kind of specialist are you? Myreth asked, his tone still edged with skepticism. I work primarily in conflict zones, where children are directly at risk, Callum said. Rescue operations, extraction from hostile territory, negotiations with parties holding minors against their will. It's been my focus for most of my career. The room fell silent for a moment as his words settled over us. I glanced at Doran, whose expression mirrored my own confusion. A rescuer. Earth had sent us a rescuer, someone trained to retrieve children from dangerous situations, not someone equipped to face down an entire hostile fleet. Forgive me, I said slowly, trying to keep the disbelief from creeping into my voice, but I fail to see how retrieving children from dangerous situations translates into defending an entire star system from a hostile military force. It doesn't, directly, Callum admitted, but your distress signal mentioned children specifically, Princess. You described a refugee station housing thousands of them, currently under threat. That detail is what triggered my deployment, rather than a purely military response. I remembered the message I had recorded days earlier, remembered mentioning Station Halvan and the children sheltered there, among the broader details of our desperate situation. I had not expected that single detail to be the deciding factor in who Earth chose to send. So you were sent specifically because of the children, I said, understanding beginning to dawn even as new questions took its place. Not because of the broader military conflict. That's correct, Callum said. Earth Defense Coordination has a very specific protocol for situations involving children in active conflict zones. When that protocol triggers, I'm typically the one deployed, regardless of the broader scale of the surrounding conflict. Myreth leaned forward, his skepticism giving way to something closer to disbelief. You are telling us that an entire war, one already responsible for the deaths of thousands of our people, warranted only a single representative because a distress signal happened to mention children. I'm telling you that mentioning children changed the nature of the response, Callum said, his voice remaining even despite the growing tension in the room. I understand that sounds strange from your perspective, but I'd ask you to trust that Earth Defense Coordination has reasons for structuring things this way, reasons that go beyond what might seem logical on the surface. I studied him carefully, searching for any hint of arrogance or deception in his expression, but found only the same calm certainty he had carried since stepping off his ship. Whatever doubts I harbored about his ability to help us, I found myself increasingly convinced that he believed, without hesitation, in his own capacity to make a difference. Very well, I said finally. Explain your intended approach. Station Halvan remains under threat, and I need to know whether you intend to assist with its defense or whether your presence here serves some other purpose entirely. Callum activated another section of his projected display, revealing what appeared to be a rough outline of our system, including the current positions of our remaining fleet and the last known Jarn incursion points. I'd like to start by understanding exactly what's happening at Station Halvan and any other locations where civilians, especially children, are currently at risk. Once I have a clear picture, I can determine the most effective way to help. And if your assessment concludes that a single individual cannot meaningfully assist against an enemy fleet, Myreth pressed, clearly still unconvinced. Callum met his gaze steadily. Then I'll tell Princess Aelthara exactly that, and I'll request additional support from Earth immediately. I'm not here to waste your time with false promises, Counselor. If I determine I cannot help, I will say so plainly. Something about his directness disarmed even Myreth's persistent hostility, if only slightly. The counselor sat back in his chair, his expression still guarded, but marginally less combative than before. Very well, I said, deciding to extend at least provisional trust, given the alternative was outright dismissing our only offered assistance. I will have my staff prepare a full briefing on Station Halvan's current situation, along with details on every other location currently under threat. You will have full access to our tactical information. Thank you, Princess, Callum said, and for the first time since arriving, something like genuine warmth entered his expression. I know this isn't what you expected when you sent that distress signal. I understand the disappointment. But I'd ask you to give me a chance to show you what I can actually do before writing off Earth's response as inadequate. I held his gaze for a long moment, weighing the desperation of our situation against the strange, unshakable confidence radiating from this ordinary-looking man who claimed no military training beyond rescuing children from danger. Every rational part of me insisted this was a mistake, that we had wasted precious time waiting for aid that could not possibly match the scale of what we faced. But another part of me, the part that had watched him walk through that airlock without a hint of fear despite stepping directly into an active war zone, wondered if perhaps Earth understood something about this conflict that we did not yet grasp. You have until the next Jarn assault to prove your worth, Mr. Whitfield, I said finally. I hope, for the sake of my people, that Earth's confidence in you is not misplaced. It isn't, he said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made me want, desperately, to believe him. The briefing that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, during which Callum absorbed every detail about Station Halvan, the surrounding Zarn positions, and the broader scope of the conflict, with an intensity that surprised me, given his earlier calm demeanor. He asked precise, pointed questions about troop movements, about the specific tactics the Zarn employed, about the exact number and ages of children sheltered at each threatened location. His questions revealed a mind far sharper and more analytical than his unassuming appearance suggested, and by the time the briefing concluded, I found myself reconsidering my initial assessment of the man Earth had chosen to send. Whatever Callum Whitfield truly was, he was not simply a rescuer stumbling blindly into a conflict beyond his understanding, and as I watched him study the tactical display with quiet, focused intensity, I began to wonder exactly what kind of man could inspire such confidence from an entire planetary defense coordination system, and exactly what experiences had shaped him into someone capable of walking into a war zone, carrying nothing but a satchel, and an unshaken belief in his own ability to help. I dismissed the briefing session near what our ship's cycle marked as evening, though time meant little aboard a vessel constantly braced for the next attack. Callum requested quarters near the command deck, explaining he preferred to remain close to any developing situation, rather than isolated in guest accommodations further from the action. I granted the request, still uncertain what to make of the strange, quiet man who had spent hours studying our tactical situation, with an intensity that unsettled even my most experienced officers. It was Doran who came to me later that night, his expression troubled, carrying a data pad filled with information he had apparently spent hours gathering. "Princess, I think you should see this," he said, setting the pad before me in my private quarters. After the briefing, I grew curious about our guest. I reached out to some contacts within the trade networks, people who have dealt with humans before in commercial capacities. I wanted to understand more about who exactly we invited aboard our ship. "And what did you find?" I asked, setting aside the reports I had been reviewing. "Fragments, mostly, second-hand accounts. Rumors passed between traders who occasionally cross paths with human vessels. But, Princess, several of these accounts mention a name matching our guest, and none of them describe him the way he described himself to us." I felt a chill settle over me despite the climate-controlled comfort of my quarters. "Show me." Doran activated the pad, revealing a series of loosely connected reports, translated imperfectly from various trade languages, each one referencing encounters with a human operative whose description matched Callum closely enough to leave little doubt. The report spoke of conflicts resolved with unsettling speed, of armed groups that dissolved or surrendered following his involvement, of situations that should have required significant military intervention, instead concluding within days, through means the report struggled to properly explain. "This account here," Doran said, highlighting one particular entry, describes a merchant convoy that regularly transported goods through a region controlled by armed raiders who extorted heavy tolls from anyone passing through. The raiders had held the region for over a decade, resistant to every attempt by local authorities to dislodge them. According to this trader, a human matching our guest's description arrived alone, and within a single cycle, the raiders abandoned the region entirely, leaving behind captured hostages, including several children who had been taken during previous raids. I read through the account carefully, my earlier skepticism giving way to something closer to unease. The report offered no specific details about how the situation had actually been resolved, only the outcome, described with a kind of hushed reverence that suggested the traitor himself did not fully understand what he had witnessed. There are others, Doran continued, scrolling through additional entries. A situation involving a smuggling operation that trafficked and captured miners across several systems, dismantled entirely after this same individual became involved. Local authorities credited the operation's collapse to internal disputes among the smugglers themselves, but this traitor's account suggests otherwise. What does the account suggest? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. That the internal disputes were not internal at all, Doran said quietly. That someone forced them, systematically, one after another, until the entire network collapsed under its own weight. I set the pad down, staring at it as though the information itself might rearrange into something less unsettling if I simply waited long enough. The man I had met earlier that day, the calm, unassuming figure who spoke gently about his work rescuing children and made no claims of military prowess, apparently carried a reputation among certain circles that painted an entirely different picture. Counselor Mireth called him primitive, I said slowly. Underestimated him, as I nearly did myself, based purely on his appearance and manner. But these accounts suggest something else entirely. There is one more report I think you should see, Doran said, his voice dropping lower, as though even discussing it too loudly might invite unwanted attention. It comes from a source closer to human space itself, a trader who does regular business within their systems. According to this account, human authorities themselves maintain a certain distance from our guest, a kind of professional caution that suggests even his own people regard him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Explain, I said. This particular specialization, rescuing children from dangerous situations, apparently represents one of the most demanding roles within their entire defense structure, Doran said. According to this trader, very few individuals within Earth's system possess the particular combination of skills required for such work, and those who do are treated with an unusual degree of deference by their own military command structure, despite operating largely outside traditional command hierarchies. I absorbed this information slowly, feeling the earlier disappointment I had carried since Callum's arrival begin to shift into something else entirely, something closer to cautious hope, tempered by genuine unease. If these fragmented reports held even a portion of truth, then Earth had not sent us an inadequate response to our desperate plea. They had sent us something far more specialized, and potentially far more dangerous to our enemies, than any conventional fleet could have provided. Does Counselor Mireth know about these reports? I asked. Not yet, Princess. I came to you first. Keep it that way for now, I said. I want to understand more before this becomes common knowledge among the Council. If Mireth learns our guest carries this kind of reputation, he may either overcorrect into blind trust, or dismiss the reports entirely as exaggeration. I need a clearer picture before either reaction takes hold. Doran nodded, gathering the pad and preparing to leave, though he hesitated at the doorway. Princess, if these accounts are accurate, what does that mean for how we proceed? Do we trust him fully with our defense, or does this reputation suggest something we should be cautious of as well? It was a fair question, one I had already begun turning over in my mind before he asked it aloud. A man capable of dismantling armed operations single-handedly, capable of inspiring such careful deference from his own government, was undoubtedly capable of great things. But such capability could cut in multiple directions, and I could not ignore the possibility that whatever methods he employed to achieve these outcomes might carry costs I had not yet considered. We proceed carefully, I said finally. We give him the opportunity to prove himself as he requested, but we remain vigilant. If these reports are accurate, then we may have finally received the assistance we desperately need. But I will not extend blind trust to any individual, regardless of reputation, until I witness his capabilities myself. Doran left shortly after, and I remained alone in my quarters for a long while, staring out at the stars visible through my viewport, contemplating the strange turn our situation had taken. I thought back to my initial disappointment upon seeing Callum step through that airlock alone, My certainty that Earth had misunderstood the severity of our plea, or simply did not consider our conflict worthy of a more substantial response. Now, faced with fragments of a reputation that painted him as something far more formidable than his calm, unassuming exterior suggested, I found myself questioning everything I had assumed about the man now residing just a few corridors from my own quarters. I did not sleep well that night, my mind cycling through the various accounts Doran had shared, trying to reconcile the gentle, patient man who had spoken so calmly about rescuing children with the shadowy figure described in second-hand trader reports, capable of dismantling entire criminal networks through means nobody seemed able to properly articulate. Perhaps both descriptions were accurate simultaneously. Perhaps the very qualities that made him effective at protecting children, an unwavering commitment, a refusal to accept failure as an option, translated into something far more formidable when directed against those who threatened them. I rose early the next morning, well before the ship's standard cycle would normally have me awake, driven by a restless need to understand more about the man Earth had entrusted with our survival. I found him already on the command deck, standing before the tactical display, studying the positions of Zharn forces with the same intense focus he had shown during the previous day's briefing. "You're awake early, Princess," he said without turning, apparently having noticed my approach despite his attention remaining fixed on the display. "As are you," I replied, moving to stand beside him. "Do you require rest, Mr. Whitfield, or does your species function differently than I understand?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I require rest, same as anyone, Princess, but I find it difficult to sleep soundly when children remain in danger nearby." Old habit, I suppose. I studied his profile as he continued examining the display, searching for some outward sign of the capabilities described in the reports Doran had shared with me the previous night. I found nothing beyond the same quiet, focused calm I had witnessed since his arrival. "I received some information last night," I said carefully, deciding directness would serve better than continued speculation. "Fragmentary accounts, second-hand and difficult to verify, but accounts nonetheless, describing certain incidents involving someone matching your description. Incidents that suggest your capabilities extend considerably beyond what you described to us yesterday." Callum finally turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable for a long moment, before something like resigned acceptance settled over his features. "I imagine word travels, even across the distances involved here. What exactly did these accounts describe?" "Armed groups dissolving, following your involvement, criminal networks collapsing under circumstances nobody could adequately explain. A reputation apparently that inspires a particular kind of caution, even among your own people's command structure." He was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully before speaking. "I won't insult you by pretending those accounts are entirely wrong, Princess. But I also won't confirm every detail, partly because rumors tend to exaggerate, and partly because some of what I do isn't something I discuss openly, even with allies." "Then confirm what you can," I pressed. "I need to understand exactly what capabilities Earth has sent to defend my people, Mr. Whitfield. Vague reassurances will not suffice, not when thousands of lives depend on the outcome of whatever you intend to attempt." He studied me for a long moment, something calculating behind his calm exterior, weighing perhaps how much trust to extend, how much of himself to reveal to someone he had known for barely a full day. Finally, he nodded, as though reaching some internal decision. "What I can tell you, Princess, is that when children are placed in danger, I do not accept failure as an outcome," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. "I don't carry weapons in the traditional sense because I've found they're rarely necessary for what I do. But I promise you this: whatever threatens Station Halvan, whatever threatens any child under my protection, will find dealing with me considerably more difficult than dealing with your fleet." The quiet certainty in his voice, combined with everything Doran had shared the previous night, sent a shiver through me that I could not quite identify as fear, or something closer to relief. Whatever Earth had truly sent us, it was not the inadequate, disappointing response I had initially assumed. And as I stood beside him on that command deck, watching the tactical display continue tracking Zharn movements toward Station Halvan, I began to understand that the true nature of the weapon Earth had provided us remained far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone aboard my ship had yet fully grasped. The alert came just past midday, cutting through the uneasy quiet that had settled over the command deck since my conversation with Callum that morning. Doran's console flashed red, and his voice carried a sharpness I had not heard from him before. "Princess, Station Halvan is reporting direct contact. Jarn forces have breached the outer perimeter." I felt my chest tighten as I moved quickly to the main display, watching the tactical readout populate with hostile contacts converging on the station's location. Callum remained beside the display where he had stood for much of the morning, his expression shifting from calm focus to something sharper, more alert, though he still betrayed no outward panic. "How many hostile ships?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "7 confirmed, possibly more approaching," Doran said. "Station Halvan's defensive capacity was never designed to withstand a coordinated assault of this scale, Princess. Their shields will fail within the hour if reinforcements do not arrive. Send everything we have remaining," I ordered, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew our remaining fleet would arrive too late, positioned as they were defending other vulnerable points throughout our territory. The distances involved meant any reinforcement, however swift, would take hours to reach Halvan, hours the station likely did not have. "Princess, our nearest available ships are at minimum 3 hours out," Doran confirmed grimly. "Station Halvan cannot hold that long against 7 hostile vessels." I felt panic rising in my chest, the same helpless dread I had experienced repeatedly over the past months, as reports of falling stations and dying civilians crossed my desk with sickening regularity. 4,000 children sheltered within that station's lower decks, and I had no way to reach them in time. "I can be there faster," Callum said quietly, and every head on the command deck turned toward him. "Your ship's capabilities are unknown to us," Mareth said, having arrived on the deck moments earlier, his earlier hostility toward Callum apparently forgotten in the face of the unfolding crisis. "How can you possibly reach Station Halvan faster than our fastest vessels?" "Because my ship wasn't built the way yours were," Callum said simply, already moving toward the door leading toward the docking bay where his vessel remained secured. "Princess, I need permission to depart immediately. Every minute we spend discussing this is a minute those children don't have." I hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Permission granted. Go." Callum moved with a speed and purpose that contrasted sharply with the calm, measured demeanor he had displayed since arriving aboard my ship, and I found myself following him toward the docking bay, driven by a need to witness whatever came next, rather than simply monitor it from a distance through second-hand reports. "Princess, this is unwise," Mareth called after me, though I ignored him, matching Callum's pace as we moved through the corridors toward the bay. "You said your ship could reach Halvan faster than our fleet," I said as we walked. "How much faster?" "Fast enough," he said, offering nothing further, his focus entirely fixed on the path ahead. We reached the docking bay within minutes, and I watched as Callum's small, unassuming vessel came alive, with soft, pulsing light along its hull, a sight that had not accompanied its earlier arrival. The ship's exterior seemed to shift subtly, panels realigning in ways that suggested capabilities far beyond what its plain appearance had initially suggested. "Princess, I need to depart now," Callum said, already moving toward the airlock, connecting his vessel to our bay. "I'll maintain communication once I'm underway, but I cannot promise regular updates given the circumstances." "Go," I said again, watching as he disappeared through the airlock without further hesitation. The docking clamps released moments later, and Callum's vessel drifted free from our ship before igniting its engines with a burst of light that forced several nearby crew members to shield their eyes. What followed defied everything I understood about interstellar travel. The vessel simply vanished, not through any gradual acceleration I could perceive, but through some form of transition my sensors struggled to properly track, leaving behind only a faint, dissipating trail of energy where the ship had been moments before. "Sensors show it's gone, Princess," a nearby technician reported, his voice carrying disbelief. "Trajectory calculations suggest, if this reading is accurate, that the vessel will reach Station Halvan's coordinates within minutes, not hours." I stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty space where Callum's ship had been, trying to comprehend the implications of what I had just witnessed. Our own fastest vessels required hours to traverse the same distance, and this single, unassuming ship had apparently covered it in a fraction of that time through means our technology could not even properly measure. "Return to the command deck," I said finally, forcing myself to move despite the questions swirling through my mind. "I want continuous monitoring of Station Halvin's situation, and I want to know the moment any contact is established." The following hour passed with an agonizing slowness that made every minute feel like an hour in itself. I remained on the command deck, watching the tactical display, listening to fragmented reports filtering in from Station Halvin's remaining defensive systems as the Zharn assault continued its relentless pressure against the station's failing shields. "Princess, Station Halvin's outer shields have failed," Doran reported grimly, roughly 40 minutes after Callum's departure. "Zharn forces are attempting to breach the station's hull directly." I felt my heart sink, certain we were about to receive confirmation of a tragedy I had failed to prevent despite every effort. "Any word from Callum? From his ship?" "Nothing yet, Princess. His vessel's signature disappeared from our sensors entirely once it reached Halvin's vicinity. We cannot confirm whether he successfully engaged the situation or whether something has gone wrong." The silence that followed felt unbearable, every second stretching into what seemed like an eternity, as I waited for any indication of what was happening at that besieged station. Mireth stood nearby, his expression grim, though for once he offered no criticism, no reminder of his earlier skepticism regarding our human guest's capabilities. "Princess, I'm receiving something," Doran said suddenly, his console chiming with an incoming transmission. "It's Station Halvin's remaining command structure. Audio only, heavily degraded. Play it," I ordered immediately. The transmission crackled through the command deck speakers, distorted and fragmented, but unmistakably carrying tones of confusion, mixed with something approaching disbelief. A station officer's voice, barely audible through the static, described events unfolding aboard Halvin that defied easy explanation. Unidentified vessel arrived without warning, engaged multiple Zharn ships simultaneously, unable to properly track engagement methods. Several hostile vessels have withdrawn entirely. Remaining forces appear to be in active retreat. I gripped the edge of my console, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. "Confirm their status," I said. "I need to know if Station Halvin has survived." Doran worked quickly, attempting to establish a clearer connection with the station's command structure, and several tense minutes passed before a stronger transmission finally came through, the station's ranking officer speaking with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief that mirrored my own growing sense of shock. "Princess Aelthara, this is Station Halvin Command. I am pleased to report that the immediate threat has been neutralized. All Zharn forces have either withdrawn or been rendered incapable of continuing their assault. Casualties among our civilian population remain minimal, and I am told all children sheltered within the station's lower decks remain entirely unharmed." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, relief washing over me with an intensity that nearly buckled my knees. 4,000 children, safe. A station that should have fallen within the hour, somehow standing intact against odds that should have made survival impossible. "What happened?" I asked, though I suspected the officer possessed no better explanation than the fragmented reports we had already received. "How was the threat neutralized?" There was a pause before the officer responded, his voice carrying an odd quality, something between awe and lingering disbelief. "Princess, I am not entirely certain how to answer that question adequately. The human representative arrived and engaged the Zharn forces directly. I did not witness the full engagement myself, as I remained within our command bunker throughout the assault. But those who did witness it describe events that, frankly, I struggle to properly convey through a standard report." "Try," I said simply. "They describe him moving through the station's compromised sections alone, engaging Zharn boarding parties directly, and somehow, systematically, ending their capacity to continue the assault. Several witnesses described the remaining Zharn forces withdrawing, not through any tactical decision, but through what appeared to be something closer to fear." I absorbed this information slowly, the pieces beginning to align with the fragmented reports Doran had shared with me the previous night. Accounts of armed groups dissolving following Callum's involvement, of situations resolving through means nobody seemed capable of fully explaining. Whatever he had done aboard Station Halvin, it had proven sufficient to turn back an assault our own fleet could not have reached in time to prevent. Is Mr. Whitfield still present aboard the station? I asked. He remains here, Princess, currently assisting with medical support for those injured during the initial assault, before the Zharn forces withdrew. He has requested that we relay a message to you directly. Send it. The officer's voice shifted slightly, apparently reading from a recorded message. The message states simply, all children accounted for and safe, station secure. Will provide full report upon return. I felt something loosen in my chest that had remained tight since the earliest days of this devastating conflict. A fragile thread of genuine hope that I had not allowed myself to fully embrace until this moment. Around me, the command deck erupted into quiet, relieved murmurs. Officers who had braced themselves for another devastating loss, instead processing news of an impossible victory. Mireth approached slowly, his earlier hostility toward Callum entirely absent from his expression now, replaced instead by something closer to stunned reconsideration. Princess, I believe I owe our guest a considerable apology, once he returns. Perhaps, I said, though my mind remained fixed on the larger implications of what had just occurred. A single man, unarmed by any conventional measure, had single-handedly repelled an assault that should have overwhelmed an entire station's defenses within the hour. The fragmented trader reports Doran had shared with me the previous night suddenly felt less like exaggerated rumor and more like understated fact. I thought back to Callum's words from that morning, his quiet certainty when he told me that whatever threatened children under his protection would find dealing with him considerably more difficult than dealing with our fleet. I had believed him, cautiously, uncertain how much weight his confidence truly carried. Now, standing on my command deck receiving confirmation of an impossible victory, I understood that his confidence had been entirely justified. Whatever Earth had truly sent us, whatever capabilities lay hidden beneath Callum Whitfield's calm, unassuming exterior, I began to suspect that my initial assessment upon his arrival, my disappointment that Earth had sent one man rather than an entire fleet, had been fundamentally, dangerously mistaken. And as reports continued filtering in from Station Halvan describing an engagement that defied conventional explanation, I found myself both relieved and deeply unsettled by the realization that the man now returning to my ship carried capabilities far beyond anything I had previously encountered. Capabilities that our enemies, the Zharn Collective, were only just beginning to understand they now faced. Callum returned to my flagship roughly 6 hours after the engagement at Station Halvan concluded, his vessel docking with the same quiet efficiency that had marked his initial arrival days earlier. I met him personally at the airlock this time, unable to suppress my curiosity, despite the exhaustion evident in his posture as he stepped through into our docking bay. "Princess," he said, offering a tired nod of acknowledgement. "I trust the reports reached you already." "They did," I said, studying him carefully. Small marks of the engagement remained visible now that I looked closely. Minor scuffs along his clothing, a faint bruise forming along his jaw that had not been present when he departed. Nothing severe, but enough to confirm that whatever had occurred aboard Station Halvan had not come without personal cost. "Are you injured?" "Nothing serious," he said, waving off the concern. "The children are what matter. They're safe, and that's what I came here to ensure." I fell into step beside him as we made our way toward the command deck, aware of the curious glances from crew members who had already heard fragmented accounts of what transpired at Halvan. The reports we received described events that were, frankly, difficult to fully comprehend. Multiple Zharn vessels either withdrawing or rendered incapable of continuing their assault, accomplished by a single individual acting alone. I would appreciate a clearer understanding of what actually occurred. Callum was quiet for a long moment before responding, his expression thoughtful rather than evasive. "I don't typically go into detail about the specifics of these engagements, Princess, partly because the details themselves aren't particularly relevant to the outcome, and partly because some of what happens in these situations isn't easy to explain to those unfamiliar with it." "I understand your reluctance," I said, "but Princess or not, I am responsible for the safety of my entire people, and I need to understand exactly what resources I now have available to protect them. If your capabilities extend to single-handedly repelling a coordinated assault of 7 vessels, I need to know the scope and limitations of what you can accomplish, so that I might deploy that resource wisely in the days ahead." He considered this for a moment, apparently weighing the reasonableness of my request against whatever reservations he carried about revealing more of himself. "Fair enough," he said finally. "What I can tell you is this. My focus during that engagement wasn't on destroying Jarn vessels or forces broadly. It was entirely on ensuring the children sheltered within that station remained safe. Everything else followed from that singular priority. But the Jarn forces withdrew," I pressed. "Multiple vessels. By the reports I received, that suggests something beyond simple defensive action. When someone threatens what I've committed myself to protecting, I don't limit my response to purely defensive measures," Callum said, his tone remaining even despite the weight behind his words. "I make it clear, as directly and unmistakably as necessary, that continuing their current course of action carries consequences they will find unacceptable. Most hostile forces, when faced with that reality clearly enough, choose to withdraw rather than continue." I studied him as we walked, trying to reconcile the calm, measured man beside me with the capabilities his own words suggested. "And if they do not choose to withdraw? If they continue regardless of whatever consequences you present them with?" His expression shifted subtly, something harder settling behind his eyes for just a moment before returning to its usual calm. "Then they stop being a threat to the children I'm protecting, Princess. One way or another." The quiet finality in his voice sent a chill through me, not from any implied threat directed at myself or my people, but from the absolute certainty with which he spoke, a certainty that suggested he had faced this exact calculation many times before and had never once wavered from his conclusion. Whatever methods he employed, I understood now that they carried a weight and consequence that our own military forces, for all their conventional strength, simply could not match. We reached the command deck to find Mirith waiting, along with several senior officers, all of them watching Callum's approach with expressions that had shifted considerably from the skepticism and hostility of days earlier. Mirith stepped forward first, and to my surprise, offered a formal bow of respect, a gesture I had rarely seen him extend to anyone outside the Dominion's own nobility. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier contempt, "I owe you an apology for my previous conduct. I misjudged both your capabilities and your commitment to our people's safety. Station Halvan's survival stands as testament to Earth's response being far more substantial than I initially credited." "No apology necessary, Counselor," Callum said, though something in his expression suggested he appreciated the gesture regardless. "Your skepticism was reasonable, given the circumstances. I'd rather earn trust through action than demand it through assumption." I found myself increasingly drawn to this quality in Callum, a genuine humility that seemed entirely at odds with the formidable capabilities he had just demonstrated. Most individuals capable of what he had accomplished at Station Halvan, I suspected, would have carried themselves with considerably more arrogance, more insistence on recognition for their achievements. Callum seemed almost uncomfortable with the praise, redirecting attention instead toward the safety of those he had protected, rather than his own role in securing it. "We should discuss our broader strategy moving forward," I said, gesturing toward the tactical display that continued tracking Jarn positions throughout our territory. Station Halvan represents one victory, but the broader conflict remains far from resolved. I need to understand how your capabilities might apply to our larger defensive efforts. Callum moved toward the display, studying the scattered Jarn positions with the same focused intensity he had shown during our initial briefing days earlier. My priority remains protecting civilian populations, particularly children, wherever they're threatened throughout your territory. I can't single-handedly turn back an entire invading fleet, Princess. That's simply not realistic, regardless of what capabilities I bring to individual engagements. "Then what can you accomplish?" Mirith asked, his tone curious rather than challenging now. "I can respond rapidly to specific threats against civilian populations, as demonstrated at Halvan. I can potentially gather intelligence on Jarn command structures and priorities, information that might prove valuable for your broader military strategy. And if the situation calls for it, I can engage directly with Jarn leadership, should the opportunity arise, in ways that might discourage further aggression against protected populations." I considered this carefully, recognizing both the value and the limitations of what he described. Callum represented a powerful, specialized resource, capable of preventing specific tragedies but not, by his own admission, capable of single-handedly winning our broader war against the Zharn Collective. That responsibility still rested with our remaining fleet, with whatever strategic decisions I made in the days and weeks ahead. Very well, I said. I will have my staff coordinate with you directly, regarding any locations where civilian populations, particularly children, face imminent threat. Your priority will remain protecting those populations, while our military forces continue addressing the broader conflict. That works for me, Princess, Callum said, though something in his expression suggested he was already considering broader implications beyond our immediate arrangement. There's something else you should know, he continued after a moment's hesitation. The reports my ship gathered during the engagement at Halvan revealed some details about Zharn command structure and priorities that concerned me. Details I think you should be aware of as we plan our next steps. Go on, I said, my earlier relief giving way to renewed tension at the seriousness in his tone. The scale and coordination of the assault against Station Halvan suggests this wasn't a random target. Someone within Zharn Command specifically selected that location, likely aware of the civilian population sheltered there. That level of intelligence gathering suggests the Zharn Collective may be deliberately targeting locations they believe will cause maximum psychological impact on your population, rather than pursuing purely strategic military objectives. I felt a fresh wave of dread settle over me at this revelation. If the Zharn were deliberately targeting locations sheltering children, specifically to demoralize our population, rather than pursue conventional military strategy, then our broader defensive planning needed to account for an enemy whose priorities extended beyond simple territorial conquest. This changes our calculations considerably, Mareth said grimly, apparently reaching the same conclusion I had. If the Zharn are deliberately targeting civilian shelters, we need to reassess every location currently housing vulnerable populations throughout our territory. I agree, Callum said. And Princess, I'd like to propose something. Rather than simply responding to Zharn assaults after they've already begun, I believe we should consider a more proactive approach, identifying vulnerable locations before they're targeted, and reinforcing their defenses preemptively. That would require significant coordination between your capabilities and our broader intelligence network, I said, already turning the logistics over in my mind. But, if it prevents future situations like Station Halvan from developing into full crises before we can respond adequately, it may be worth the additional coordination required. I'll do whatever's necessary to prevent another situation like today, Callum said, and the quiet determination in his voice left no doubt that he meant every word. I came here to help protect your people, Princess, and that's exactly what I intend to continue doing, regardless of what it requires of me personally. As our discussion continued late into the evening, developing the framework for a more coordinated defensive strategy, incorporating Callum's unique capabilities alongside our conventional military forces, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my perception of this quiet, unassuming man had shifted since his initial arrival. The disappointment I had felt upon seeing him step alone through that airlock had given way first to cautious curiosity, then to genuine astonishment following the events at Station Halvan. And now, as I watched him work through complex tactical considerations with a clarity and focus that belied his earlier claims of simply being a rescuer rather than a warrior, something closer to profound respect. But even as that respect grew, so too did a persistent unease that I could not fully shake, an awareness that the capabilities Callum possessed, however dedicated to protecting the innocent, represented something far beyond what our galaxy's conventional understanding of military power typically encompassed. The Zharn Collective had targeted Station Halvan believing it represented an easy, demoralizing victory against a weakened Dominion. Instead, they had inadvertently revealed themselves to something far more dangerous than any fleet we could have assembled. Something that operated according to principles our enemies, I suspected, did not yet fully understand, and would come to regret underestimating. 3 weeks passed following the engagement at Station Halvan, weeks during which the framework Callum and I had developed together began reshaping the entire trajectory of our conflict with the Zharn Collective. Working alongside our intelligence officers, he helped identify 17 additional locations throughout our territory, sheltering vulnerable civilian populations, each one reinforced preemptively before Zharn forces could target them. 4 of those locations faced actual assaults during those 3 weeks, and in every instance, Callum's rapid response prevented what would otherwise have been devastating losses. Word of these engagements spread quickly, not just through our own territory, but apparently through Zarn communication networks as well, judging by the shift in their tactics that became increasingly apparent as the weeks progressed. Assaults against civilian locations grew noticeably less frequent, and when they did occur, they carried an unmistakable hesitancy, an apparent unwillingness to commit substantial forces to targets that might trigger Callum's involvement. I sat in my private council chamber one evening, reviewing the latest reports with Doran and Mirith, when a new transmission arrived that would prove to reshape everything we had built over the preceding weeks. "Princess, we have an urgent situation," Doran said, his expression grave as he studied the incoming report. "Zarn forces have seized control of our outpost at Farron's Reach. Initial reports indicate they've taken the entire facility, including the refugee population sheltered there, as hostages." I felt my stomach drop. Farron's Reach housed nearly 600 children, evacuated from border territories months earlier, along with their caretakers, and a small garrison responsible for the outpost's defense. How did this happen? Our defenses at Farron's Reach were supposed to be reinforced according to our coordination with Callum. The garrison commander's reports suggest the Zarn force that struck was considerably larger and better coordinated than anything we've encountered previously, Doran said. "This wasn't a standard assault, Princess. This appears to have been a deliberate, targeted operation." "Where is Callum?" I asked, already moving toward the door. "His ship is currently docked, Princess. I've already sent word requesting his immediate presence." Callum arrived on the command deck moments later, his expression shifting from calm alertness to something considerably more serious as he absorbed the details of the unfolding crisis. "Tell me everything you know," he said, moving directly to the tactical display. "Zarn forces have seized the entire outpost at Farron's Reach," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "They're holding the children sheltered there, along with their caretakers, as apparent hostages. We don't yet understand their objective." Callum studied the tactical display in silence for a long moment before responding. "This is different from previous engagements," he said finally. "The Zarn have been retreating from direct confrontation with me for weeks now. This suggests they've changed their approach entirely, likely in direct response to that pattern." "Meaning what exactly?" Mirith asked, his earlier confidence in our developing strategy giving way to renewed concern. "Meaning they've likely anticipated my involvement and prepared specifically to counter it," Callum said grimly. "Taking hostages rather than simply attacking directly suggests they intend to use the safety of those children as leverage, understanding correctly that their safety is my absolute priority." I felt a fresh wave of dread settle over me as the implications became clear. The Zarn Collective, having learned to fear direct confrontation with Callum, had apparently devised a strategy specifically designed to exploit the very principle that made him so effective, using the children he was committed to protecting as a shield against his intervention. "What are your intentions?" I asked, watching him carefully. "I'm requesting a single shuttle and safe passage to Farron's Reach," Callum said, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous calm that I had not heard from him since our earliest conversations, before I had witnessed what he was truly capable of. "I intend to speak directly with whoever commands the Zarn forces holding that outpost." "That seems remarkably dangerous," Mirith said. "If they're prepared for your involvement, walking directly into their custody seems exactly what they want." "Perhaps," Callum said, "but every alternative I can consider risks the safety of those children more than a direct conversation would. I need 30 minutes alone with their commander, nothing more." I studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of the confidence that had carried him through every previous engagement, uncertain whether what I saw now represented that same unwavering certainty or something closer to desperate necessity, given the constraints of the situation. "You believe this conversation can resolve the situation without further conflict," I said, though it came out more as a question than a statement. "I believe it's the option most likely to ensure every child at that outpost survives this situation unharmed," Callum said carefully. "Whether that resolution comes through conversation or through other means depends entirely on how their commander chooses to respond." I understood, even without him stating it explicitly, that his words carried a weight beyond simple diplomatic negotiation. Whatever transpired during those 30 minutes, Callum intended to ensure the outcome favored the safety of those children, regardless of what that ultimately required. "You have my authorization," I said finally, against every instinct urging me toward caution. "But I want continuous monitoring of the situation, and if anything indicates you require additional support, I want our remaining forces positioned to respond immediately." "Understood, Princess," Callum said, already moving toward the door leading to the docking bay. The following hour passed with an agonizing tension that reminded me painfully of the wait during his engagement at Station Halvan weeks earlier, though this time, carrying an additional weight given the deliberate, calculated nature of whatever the Zarn intended with their hostage strategy. I remained on the command deck, watching sensor readings track Callum's shuttle as it approached Farron's reach, my hands clenched tightly against the edge of my console. "Princess, his shuttle has reached the outpost," Doran reported eventually. "He's requesting docking clearance from the Zarn forces currently controlling the facility. Do we have any visual confirmation of what's happening once he boards?" I asked. "None, Princess. Our sensors can track the shuttle's position, but we have no way of monitoring events once he's aboard the station itself." The wait that followed stretched into what felt like hours, though the ship's chronometer indicated barely 30 minutes had passed, exactly the time frame Callum had requested. I paced the command deck, unable to settle into stillness, my mind cycling through every possible outcome of whatever conversation was unfolding aboard that seized outpost. "Princess, we're receiving a transmission," Doran said suddenly, his voice tight with anticipation. "It's originating from Farron's Reach itself." "Play it," I said immediately, bracing myself for whatever news the transmission might carry. The audio that followed was fragmented, distorted by whatever damage the station's communication systems had sustained during the initial assault, but unmistakably carrying a voice I did not recognize, speaking in a language our translation systems struggled to process cleanly. The voice sounded shaken, unsteady in a way that suggested something significant had occurred. "Requesting immediate medical assistance. Commander requires evacuation. All remaining forces standing down. Repeat, all forces standing down." I stared at the display in stunned confusion, trying to make sense of the fragmented message. What does that mean? Are the children safe? What happened to Callum? Doran worked quickly to establish a clearer connection, and several tense minutes later, a stronger transmission finally came through, this time carrying a voice I did recognize, calm despite the underlying exhaustion evident in its tone. "Princess, this is Callum. The situation at Farron's Reach has been resolved. Every child sheltered here remains completely unharmed, along with their caretakers, and the outpost's original garrison. I'll need that shuttle to remain here briefly longer to assist with medical support for several Zarn personnel, but the immediate crisis has passed." Relief washed over me with an intensity that nearly buckled my knees, though it carried alongside it a fresh wave of questions I desperately needed answered. "Are you injured? What occurred aboard the station during your conversation with their commander?" "I'm fine, Princess," Callum said, though something in his tone suggested the conversation had involved considerably more than simple diplomatic exchange. "I'll provide a full report upon my return. For now, please know that the children are safe, and I don't believe the Zarn Collective will attempt a strategy like this again." The certainty in his final statement carried an implication I understood clearly, even without further explanation. Whatever had transpired during that 30-minute conversation aboard Farron's Reach had apparently convinced whoever commanded those Zarn forces that taking hostages, using the safety of children as leverage against Callum's intervention, represented a strategy with consequences far more severe than they had anticipated when they first devised it. As I stood on my command deck, absorbing the news that yet another crisis had been averted, through means I still did not fully understand, I began to grasp the true scope of what humanity had actually sent us when I dispatched that desperate distress signal weeks earlier. Not simply a rescuer capable of protecting individual locations from Zarn assault, but something that fundamentally altered the calculations of an enemy that had, until now, operated according to strategies rooted purely in conventional military advantage. The Zarn Collective had learned to fear direct confrontation with Callum. Now, following whatever had occurred aboard Farron's Reach, I suspected they were learning something considerably more significant, a lesson that would ripple outward through their entire command structure and reshape how they approached every subsequent engagement with our people. Callum returned to my flagship late that evening, and the change in the surrounding Zarn collective's behavior became apparent almost immediately in the days that followed. Reports from our border territories described a marked reduction in aggressive incursions, entire fleets that had previously pressed our defenses relentlessly, now maintaining cautious distance, as though reconsidering the wisdom of continued conflict against a dominion that apparently now counted among its allies, something the Zarn command structure had learned, through direct and painful experience, to genuinely fear. I met him privately in my quarters that night, having requested a full accounting of what had transpired aboard Farron's Reach, a request he had initially deflected during his return, but ultimately agreed to honor given the significance of what had occurred. "I won't share every detail," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, exhaustion evident in every line of his posture, despite his attempts to maintain his usual composed demeanor. "Some of it isn't relevant to your broader strategic concerns, and some of it, frankly, I'd rather not revisit in detail." "I understand," I said, though my curiosity remained undiminished. "But I need to understand enough to know what changed. Our border territories are reporting behavior from Zarn forces that suggests something fundamental has shifted in how they view this conflict." Callum was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering how much to share. "Their commander believed taking hostages would force me into a position where I'd have no choice but to negotiate on his terms," he said finally. He was mistaken about several things, not least of which was his assumption that threatening children in my presence would make me more compliant, rather than considerably less so. "What happened during your conversation?" I asked. I made clear to him, as directly as necessary, that his strategy carried consequences he had not properly anticipated, Callum said, his voice carrying the same quiet, dangerous calm I had heard before his departure for Farron's Reach. I explained that every child under threat in that facility would leave unharmed, and that whatever happened to him personally depended entirely on how quickly he chose to accept that reality. "He surrendered," I said, piecing together the implications of what he described. "Eventually," Callum said, though not before requiring rather more persuasion than I typically prefer to employ. "I don't enjoy these confrontations, Princess. I want you to understand that clearly. Every time I'm forced into a situation like the one at Farron's Reach, it represents a failure of some kind, a moment where diplomacy or deterrence proved insufficient to prevent children from being placed in danger in the first place." I studied him carefully, recognizing something in his expression that I had not fully appreciated during our earlier interactions, a genuine weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, the accumulated weight of countless similar confrontations across what I suspected had been years, perhaps decades, of this exact work. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked quietly. "This work, protecting children in conflict zones across your own territory, and now, apparently, across ours as well." "Long enough," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his features. "Long enough to understand that the specific details of any given conflict rarely matter as much as the underlying pattern. Someone in power decides that vulnerable populations, particularly children, represent acceptable losses in pursuit of some larger strategic or political objective. My role, as I've come to understand it, is ensuring that calculation always proves wrong." "And what happens to those who make that calculation regardless?" I asked, though I suspected I already understood the answer given everything I had witnessed over the preceding weeks. "They learn, eventually, that the cost of treating children as acceptable losses exceeds whatever benefit they believe they'd gain," Callum said simply. "Some learn through conversation, through simply understanding the reality of what continuing their current course would mean. Others require more direct demonstration before the lesson takes hold." I sat with his words for a long moment, reflecting on everything that had transpired since his arrival weeks earlier, from my initial disappointment at Earth's apparently inadequate response to our desperate plea, through the growing astonishment as I witnessed exactly what capabilities this quiet, unassuming man actually possessed. The Zarn Collective, an enemy that had systematically overwhelmed our conventional military forces for months, now found itself reconsidering its entire approach to this conflict. Not because of any fleet or weapon we possessed, but because of the presence of a single individual whose unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent had proven more formidable than anything else in our arsenal. "I asked you once, back when you first arrived, why Earth would send someone like you rather than a conventional military response, I said. I think I finally understand the answer, though I suspect there's more depth to it than I initially grasped. What do you understand? He asked, genuine curiosity in his expression. That conventional military strength, however substantial, ultimately measures itself against other conventional military strength, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it aloud. Fleets against fleets, weapons against weapons. But what you represent operates according to an entirely different calculation, one that doesn't measure itself against military capability at all, but against a commitment so absolute, so unwavering, that it simply cannot be countered through conventional means. Callum nodded slowly, apparently satisfied that I had grasped something significant about the nature of what he represented. Earth learned a long time ago that this kind of commitment, properly applied, achieves outcomes that conventional force often cannot, he said. It's not about matching an enemy's military strength. It's about making clear, absolutely and unmistakably, that certain lines simply cannot be crossed without consequences that exceed whatever benefit crossing them might provide. I thought about the fragmented reports Doran had shared with me weeks earlier, the accounts of armed groups dissolving, criminal networks collapsing, situations resolving through means that defied easy explanation. Every account, I now understood, likely represented the same fundamental pattern playing out across countless different contexts throughout Callum's career, a consistent, unwavering response to threats against children that had, over time, built a reputation formidable enough to reshape the calculations of anyone who might otherwise consider such threats an acceptable strategic option. The Jarn Collective will remember this conflict, I said, thinking ahead to the broader implications of what had occurred, not simply as a war against the Kethrani Dominion, but as the conflict where they learned that certain actions, regardless of strategic benefit, carry consequences too severe to justify the risk. That's my hope, Callum said, not just for the Jarn, but for anyone else watching how this conflict has unfolded. If word spreads that threatening children carries this kind of response, perhaps fewer conflicts develop in that direction in the first place. I considered the broader galaxy beyond our immediate conflict, the countless other powers, other potential adversaries, who would inevitably learn of what had transpired between the Kethrani Dominion, the Jarn Collective, and the quiet, unassuming human who had reshaped the entire trajectory of our war. Earth, I realized, had not simply sent us assistance in our specific conflict. They had sent a demonstration, a clear and unmistakable message to every power throughout this region of space about exactly what kind of response certain actions would inevitably provoke. In the weeks that followed, as our conflict with the Jarn Collective gradually shifted toward genuine negotiation rather than continued warfare, I found myself reflecting often on that initial moment when Callum had stepped through my airlock, unassuming and seemingly unprepared for the scale of what we faced. I had wanted a weapon capable of matching the Jarn's overwhelming military advantage. Earth had sent me something entirely different, something that operated according to principles I had not initially understood, but had come to recognize as far more powerful than any conventional weapon our galaxy possessed. I drafted a message to my council some months later, once our conflict with the Jarn Collective had formally concluded through negotiated terms neither side would have considered possible before Callum's involvement. I wrote it carefully, wanting to convey not simply the military outcome of our conflict, but the deeper lesson I had learned throughout the process. We requested a weapon, I wrote, and Earth sent us something far more valuable. They sent us their conscience, embodied in a single individual whose unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent proved more formidable than every warship in our combined fleets. Let this serve as a lesson to our own future strategic considerations. The greatest strength any civilization can possess is not measured purely in military capability, but in the depth of commitment to those values it refuses to compromise, regardless of cost. As I finished drafting that message, I thought of Callum, likely already deployed elsewhere, responding to some other conflict, some other group of vulnerable children requiring protection from those who would treat their safety as an acceptable cost of pursuing broader ambitions. Earth's galaxy remained largely unknown to us, its full capabilities still mostly a mystery, despite everything we had witnessed during our conflict with the Jarn Collective. But one truth had become unmistakably clear throughout those difficult months. Humanity's greatest weapon was never their warships, their weapons, or their military technology. It was people like Callum Whitfield, ordinary in appearance but carrying an extraordinary, unshakable commitment that our galaxy, accustomed to measuring strength purely through conventional military power, had never properly understood until it stood directly before us. And as word of our conflict's resolution spread throughout the surrounding regions of space, I suspected every power who had once considered Earth distant, irrelevant, or primitive would soon find themselves reconsidering that assessment entirely, understanding at last exactly what nightmare had truly arrived when that single human warship first entered our besieged system, carrying not an army, but a man who fought only for children, and who had proven, beyond any doubt, that such a commitment could reshape the fate of an entire galaxy.